The dust of the Arizona Territory in 1883 didn't just cling to your boots. It got into your soul, tasting of regret and sun-baked hardship. Sheriff Ben Carter knew that taste well. It was a dry, choking flavor that mixed poorly with the smell of stale coffee and the fear that never quite left the air of this town, Redemption Creek. He was a big man, not just in size, but in the quiet way he carried the weight of his badge, a tin star that often felt heavier than any mountain rock. But nothing prepared him for the weight of the day the train pulled in. His 5-year-old daughter, Lily, gripping his hand so tightly her small knuckles were white. The air was thick and hot, the kind of heat that made the sky wobble, but it was the stillness around the last freight car that truly made the hairs on Ben's neck stand up. People in Redemption Creek didn't stare like this unless there was trouble brewing. The kind that bloodied the saloon floor or emptied a man's pockets. This was different. This was the silent, cold stare of judgment. And then they saw her. She was hauled out of the back of a prison transport car, a shadow in the blazing sun. A woman, young, maybe 20, but with eyes that had seen 100 years of hurt. Her dress, or what was left of it, was torn and filthy, the color of old sorrow. But the worst part, the thing that made the saloon piano suddenly fall silent and the murmur of the crowd die in their throats, was the iron. Heavy, cruel chains wrapped around her slender wrists, connecting her to the ankle shackles that dragged in the dust with a sickening, metallic rasp. She didn't fight. She didn't cry. She just stumbled forward, her head bowed, her body language a testament to crushing defeat. She was just another piece of human cargo being shuffled through the unforgiving Wild West. But there was a fierce, almost unbroken spirit in the rigid line of her back. Lily's small voice, usually so bright and full of questions, cut through the silence like a splinter of ice. She didn't whisper. She asked with the simple, heartbreaking honesty of a child who doesn't yet know how to hide what she sees. "Daddy, is she dying?" Ben didn't flinch, didn't look away from the sight that was chilling him to the core. He looked down at Lily, his heart aching with the impossible task of explaining injustice to innocence. "No, sweet pea," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But she's been hurt real bad. The chains hurt her a lot, Lilybug." He saw the guards, 2 rough men with faces carved from granite and hearts just as hard, push her toward the jail. She stumbled on the uneven ground of the platform, and one of the guards sneered, yanking the chain. The sound of the metal scraping against the rail was a scream of its own. It was a sight that tore at the very thread of human decency Ben tried to weave into the fabric of his town. The charges were vague, something about a stolen horse and resisting arrest way back east. A crime that sounded too flimsy to warrant the inhuman treatment she was receiving. The truth, Ben suspected, was darker and simpler. She was a woman alone, without resources, and with a skin color that made her an easy target in the prejudiced courts of the time. She was nameless to them, just another number on a transport manifest. But Ben saw more than a number. He saw a flicker of defiance in the downturned corner of her mouth, a fierce pride in the way she kept her shoulders straight despite the heavy, grinding shame of the chains. He took Lily home first, his mind already churning. He washed the dust from his hands, but not from his soul. Later that evening, he walked back to the jailhouse alone, the moon a sliver of broken glass in the dark sky. The woman was curled up on the cot in the one cell, a figure of profound loneliness. He rattled the bars. She didn't startle. She just slowly raised her head. Her eyes, a rich, dark brown, met his. They were guarded, wary, expecting the worst. "Ma'am," Ben began, his voice soft but firm, trying to inject some human kindness into the metallic air of the cell. "I'm Sheriff Carter. I need your name." She didn't speak. She just blinked slowly, as if the sound of his decent, human voice was a foreign language. "The transport papers call you Cargo 74, he continued, taking a step closer, his hands resting on the bars. "That's not a name. Everyone's got a name. What's yours?" A long, heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the chirping of crickets outside. Finally, she spoke, her voice a dry rasp, barely above a whisper. "They took it. Said I didn't earn the right to keep it." Ben felt a surge of cold fury, a familiar emotion when faced with senseless cruelty. "Well, I don't care what they said," he stated, his eyes locking with hers. "Here, you're not a number. You're a person. If you can't give me a name, I'll give you one until you remember the one you like." He thought of the dignity she carried, the quiet strength that resisted the humiliation of the chains. "How about Sarah? It's a good, solid name. Means princess in the old book, and you've got a queenly way about you even in those rags." A flicker, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor, passed over her face. It wasn't a smile, but it was close. A ghost of a human reaction. "Sarah?" she repeated, the name tasting strange on her tongue. It was a sound of quiet acceptance. The next morning, Ben did something that made the whole town of Redemption Creek buzz with shock and disapproval. He didn't wait for the circuit judge or the paperwork. He brought a blacksmith to the cell. He knew the chains were illegal and excessive for the crime, a clear marker of the deep-seated prejudice she faced. He stood there, his presence alone a shield, as the blacksmith, a man named Jake who understood the difference between law and justice, carefully hammered the rivets until they broke free. With a heavy thud, the iron fell to the dirt floor of the cell. Sarah stood there, rubbing her raw, bruised wrists, looking not at the chains, but at Ben. The simple act of releasing her from that cold metal was a bolder statement than any sermon or legal argument. "You're still under my custody, Sarah," Ben said, his tone unwavering. "But you won't be in those." Sheriff Ben Carter had given her the dress and the name, but the real work, the battle for Sarah's dignity in the unforgiving eyes of Redemption Creek, had only just begun. The town was small, built on the shifting sands of hope and cruelty, and its whispers were louder than any pistol shot. They didn't see a woman who needed help. They saw a fugitive, a nameless Cargo 74, who was the wrong color and had the wrong history. They saw a threat. The next few days were a quiet storm of resistance. Mrs. Peterson, the store owner, stopped greeting Ben with her usual warmth, giving him only sharp, icy stares. Old Man Hemlock, who spat tobacco juice near the jailhouse, suddenly found his voice, muttering loudly about coddling criminals and how Ben was going soft. Ben heard it all, but he kept his head high, a silent wall of defiance against the tide of judgment. His duty wasn't to public opinion. It was to justice, and justice, as he saw it, meant treating every single soul with the respect they deserved, even when others refused to. Sarah, now out of the cell but still confined to the small, bare office next to it, worked. Ben had given her a broom and some cleaning supplies. It wasn't about punishment. It was about purpose. She cleaned the place meticulously, scrubbing away the grime of years, the simple act of labor an anchor in her turbulent world. He watched her from his desk, the blue calico dress a sharp contrast to the drab walls, and saw the pride in her movements. She didn't rush or complain. She worked with a quiet intensity, as if reclaiming this small, dusty space was a metaphor for reclaiming her life. The true test, however, came when Lily, Ben's bright-eyed daughter, refused to be kept away. Lilybug was drawn to Sarah with the innocent, unwavering certainty of a child. She didn't see chains or color or crime. She saw the same hurt she had noticed on the train platform, and now, a new kind of quiet strength. Lily started bringing Sarah drawings, lopsided suns, horses with too many legs, and stick-figure families. She would climb onto a stool and watch Sarah, asking a million questions. "What does Cargo 74 mean, Sarah? Why did your clothes smell bad before the blue dress?" Sarah would answer patiently, her voice still rough, but growing softer with each interaction. One afternoon, Lily brought Sarah a wilting wildflower she'd picked by the creek. "Daddy says you're waiting for the judge," Lily said, her forehead furrowed in deep thought. "He says everyone deserves to be heard." She held out the flower. "You deserve a nice flower." Sarah took the flower, her hands, still bearing the faint red marks of the shackles, trembling slightly. She looked at the flower, then at Lily, and the dam finally broke. Tears, slow and heavy, ran down her cheeks, the first tears Ben had seen her shed. They weren't tears of despair, but of profound, overwhelming gratitude. It was the first act of pure, unconditional kindness she'd received in what must have felt like a lifetime. Ben watched from the doorway, his chest tightening. He hadn't just given her a dress and a name. He'd given a small child the opportunity to remind a broken woman what it felt like to be seen as a whole, valued person. This simple, quiet exchange was the strongest act of courage and resolution the town had ever witnessed, though they were too blind to see it. Ben knew the judge wouldn't arrive for another week. He made a bold decision. He couldn't keep her locked in the office, not when he knew, deep in his gut, that the charges were mostly a cruel fabrication born of discrimination. He needed her to be ready to stand tall when the time came, not wilt away in isolation. He walked into the office one evening as the shadows stretched long across the floor. Sarah was carefully mending a tear in the blue dress, her face illuminated by the flickering oil lamp. "Sarah," he said, his voice dropping low, "I need to ask you something important. When the judge gets here, he's going to see the record. He's going to see the chains. But he also needs to see the truth. Will you tell him everything? Will you fight for your life?" She looked up, her dark eyes clear and steady. "Sheriff Carter," she said, using his name with a new, quiet pride. "I was fighting them long before they put the chains on me. That's why they put them on. But they made me small. You made me tall again. I will tell the judge. I will tell him about the man who stole my wages and lied about the horse. I will tell him everything. But I need to be ready." "You are ready," Ben affirmed. He took a deep breath. "And I'm making another change. You can't live in this office until the judge comes. You're going to stay at my house." In the spare room, Sarah was stunned into silence. "Sir, I can't." The town, Ben interrupted, his voice firm as oak. "We'll have to deal with it. They can whisper all they want. But in my house, you'll have a real bed and real meals, and you'll be close to Lily. She needs you right now, Sarah, and maybe, just maybe, you need her. And I need to know you're safe." This was the final, defining act of defiance against the cruelty of the old way of the West. Taking a woman accused of a crime, a woman the town had already condemned, into his home was more than risky. It was a testament to his belief in dignity and his willingness to sacrifice his own comfort and reputation for someone else's second life. That night, as the moon climbed high, Sarah walked the short distance from the jailhouse to the sheriff's humble home. She walked not as a prisoner, but as a guest, the weight of the past slowly lifting with each step. Ben watched her, a lone sentinel against the world's prejudice. He had given her a second chance, not just at freedom but at being human. And as she stepped across the threshold, she was no longer Cargo 74. She was Sarah, a woman with a name, a dress, and a profound, compelling story of her own, ready to stand in the harsh light of judgment and claim her rightful place in the world. The true, emotional battle for her life, and for the soul of Redemption Creek, was about to begin. Ben knew the judge wouldn't arrive for another week. He made a bold decision. He couldn't keep her locked in the office, not when he knew, deep in his gut, that the charges were mostly a cruel fabrication born of discrimination. He needed her to be ready to stand tall when the time came, not wilt away in isolation. He walked into the office one evening as the shadows stretched long across the floor. Sarah was carefully mending a tear in the blue dress, her face illuminated by the flickering oil lamp. "Sarah," he said, his voice dropping low, "I need to ask you something important. When the judge gets here, he's going to see the record. He's going to see the chains. But he also needs to see the truth. Will you tell him everything? Will you fight for your life?" She looked up, her dark eyes clear and steady. "Sheriff Carter," she said, using his name with a new, quiet pride. "I was fighting them long before they put the chains on me. That's why they put them on. But they made me small. You made me tall again. I will tell the judge. I will tell him about the man who stole my wages and lied about the horse. I will tell him everything. But I need to be ready." "You are ready," Ben affirmed. He took a deep breath. "And I'm making another change. You can't live in this office until the judge comes. You're going to stay at my house. In the spare room, Sarah was stunned into silence. "Sir, I can't." "The town." "The town?" Ben interrupted, his voice firm as oak. "We'll have to deal with it. They can whisper all they want. But in my house, you'll have a real bed and real meals, and you'll be close to Lily. She needs you right now, Sarah, and maybe, just maybe, you need her. And I need to know you're safe." This was the final, defining act of defiance against the cruelty of the old way of the West. Taking a woman accused of a crime, a woman the town had already condemned, into his home was more than risky. It was a testament to his belief in dignity and his willingness to sacrifice his own comfort and reputation for someone else's second life. That night, as the moon climbed high, Sarah walked the short distance from the jailhouse to the sheriff's humble home. She walked not as a prisoner, but as a guest, the weight of the past slowly lifting with each step. Ben watched her, a lone sentinel against the world's prejudice. He had given her a second chance, not just at freedom, but at being human. And as she stepped across the threshold, she was no longer Cargo 74. She was Sarah, a woman with a name, a dress, and a profound, compelling story of her own, ready to stand in the harsh light of judgment and claim her rightful place in the world. The true, emotional battle for her life, and for the soul of Redemption Creek, was about to begin. The small house of Sheriff Ben Carter was a haven of quiet dignity, a stark contrast to the judgmental eyes of Redemption Creek. For Sarah, entering that home was like walking into a different world, a world where the air smelled of wood smoke and decency, not iron and despair. Lily, Ben's daughter, acted as the house's guardian angel, instantly accepting Sarah not as a runaway or a criminal, but as a new, interesting adult. Lily simply pointed to the small, clean spare room. "That's your room, Sarah," she declared, her small voice full of certainty. "It has the best sun in the morning." Sarah's first nights in the house were restless. The silence of freedom was louder than the rattle of her former chains. She was used to sleeping in fear, and the soft mattress, the real blankets, and the knowledge that the sheriff's family was just across the hall felt unsettlingly like a trap. She slept with one eye open, the trauma of her life, the stealing of her wages, the false accusation over the horse, the brutal transport, a coiled snake in her gut. Ben understood this deep-seated fear. He didn't hover, but he made his presence a quiet, solid reassurance. At dinner, they ate simple meals, stew, cornbread, and conversation that carefully avoided the painful past. Lily was the bridge. She'd chatter about her school, her stray cat, and the funny way the creek water ran. She talked to Sarah naturally, her questions innocent and direct. "Do you know how to braid hair, Sarah?" she asked one evening. Sarah paused, a spoonful of stew halfway to her mouth. She hadn't thought about braiding hair, a gentle, domestic act, in years. A faint, distant memory surfaced. A young girl, a mother's hand. "A little," Sarah admitted, her voice a low murmur. The next morning, Lily appeared by the kitchen table with her small brush and a tangle of bright, brown hair. Sarah knelt behind her, her hands that had borne the heavy marks of iron, now delicately separating the strands. The rhythmic, soothing motion of the braid was a kind of therapy. As her fingers worked, Ben watched from the doorway, realizing that these small, everyday acts were the true foundation of Sarah's second life. It wasn't just the name or the dress. It was the quiet, shared humanity of caring for a child's hair. This simple moment was a profound symbol of her transition from Cargo 74 to Sarah, from a prisoner to a participant in a small, loving family. The town, meanwhile, was in a frenzy. The news that the sheriff had brought the chain woman into his house had exploded like gunpowder. The whispers turned to outright threats. Ben's deputy, a young man named Tom who was easily swayed by the crowd, came to him with a worried face. "Sheriff, they're talking about a posse. They say you're harboring a felon. They say you're setting a bad example for the children." Ben looked out the window, his gaze hard. He saw the hypocrisy of the town. They preached law and order but practiced discrimination and mob rule. "Tom," he said, his voice measured and firm, "I swore an oath to uphold the law and protect all people in this territory, not just the ones who look like me. The law says she gets a hearing, not a lynching. And my conscience says she gets treated like a human being. The woman who was in chains is gone. The woman who is braiding my daughter's hair is here. If anyone wants to come for her, they can start with me. That star is heavy, Tom, but it means something. It means justice for everyone. Ben knew his stand was dangerous. He was pitting himself against the deeply entrenched prejudices of the Wild West. But his courage was rooted not in violence, but in conviction. He was teaching Lily a more important lesson than any schoolhouse could, the lesson that dignity is non-negotiable and that the toughest fights are often the ones fought with kindness and unwavering resolution. He spent the evenings preparing Sarah for the judge. He found old law books, reading aloud sections on due process and property rights. He helped her piece together the timeline of events, the greedy foreman who stole her pay, the unjust accusation, and the rush to judgment. As she recounted the story, her voice grew stronger, losing the dusty quality of despair. The story of her life was one of relentless struggle against injustice, and in Ben, she had finally found an ally. "You need to walk in there, Sarah," Ben instructed one night, tapping a finger on the worn desk. "With your head high, you tell the truth, clearly and with pride. You tell them who you are, and you tell them that what they did to you was wrong. You look the judge straight in the eye." Sarah nodded, her hands smoothing the fabric of the blue dress. The dress, once just a garment, had become a uniform. The uniform of a woman fighting for her life, her name, and her right to a second life. She was no longer asking for mercy. She was demanding justice. The town could send its whispers and its threats, but inside Ben Carter's house, a powerful, determined woman was being forged, ready to face the world and finally turn the page on the cruel chapter of the chains. The circuit judge was due tomorrow, and Redemption Creek was about to learn the true meaning of courage. The day the circuit judge rode into Redemption Creek was a spectacle. He arrived not with the flourish of trumpets, but with the clatter of a dusty wagon and the grim, weary look of a man who'd seen too much injustice on the frontier. The entire town gathered outside the small wooden courthouse, a tight, silent crowd of judgment. They weren't there for the law. They were there for the verdict they had already decided upon. Sarah walked toward the courthouse not from the jail, but from the sheriff's home. She wore the blue calico dress, now pressed and clean, and her walk held a new pride. She was flanked by Sheriff Ben Carter, his presence a shield of solid authority. Lily walked on Sarah's other side, gripping her hand tightly. This silent procession, the lawman, the alleged fugitive, and the child, was the most powerful declaration of dignity Redemption Creek had ever witnessed. It was a stand against the cruelty of prejudice, an open challenge to the town's condemnation. Inside, the courtroom was stifling, the air heavy with expectation and barely concealed hostility. When the judge, a stern man named Judge Hawthorne with a severe mustache, called the case of Territory versus Cargo 74, Ben immediately spoke up, his voice ringing through the small room. "Your Honor, the defendant's name is Sarah, not Cargo 74. Judge Hawthorne looked down at the manifest, then sharply at Ben. "Sheriff Carter, you are out of order. You know the protocols here." "With all due respect, Judge," Ben said, unwavering. "Protocols that strip a person of their name are cruel and unjust. She has been held illegally in excessive chains, and she has a right to be addressed as a person, not a number." The judge, surprised by Ben's fierce conviction, simply nodded and wrote something on the paperwork. "Very well. Proceed, Sarah." Sarah stood before the court. She didn't look at the hostile faces in the crowd. She looked only at the judge. Ben had prepared her to tell the story of her former boss stealing her wages and then lying to claim her horse, which she had bought with years of hard-earned money. She spoke with quiet resolution, laying out the facts of her life, a narrative of honest work and repeated betrayal. Her voice was steady, gaining strength with every word. She explained how she resisted arrest only because they took her horse, her only means of travel, and how the original charges were deliberately inflated to justify her brutal transport in chains. The judge listened intently. The prosecutor, a slick, self-important man from the capital, argued that she was a proven liar and thief who had defied the law. He pointed to her clothes, her color, and her lack of a stable residence as evidence of her criminal nature. The prejudice was thick, choking the air. Just as the arguments were about to conclude and the judge looked poised to make a ruling, an unexpected thing happened. Lily, who had been sitting quietly on a bench near the front, slid off and walked straight up to the railing, clutching a faded, childish drawing of a horse with a woman riding it. "Daddy, is she dying?" The same question Lily had asked that first day cut through the courtroom silence like a bell. She looked not at the judge, but straight at the prosecutor. "You said she's bad, but bad people don't brush my hair. Bad people don't teach me songs." Lily held up the drawing. "She drew this horse for me," she announced simply. "She said she misses her horse because it was like a friend, not a thing to steal." Lily's simple, innocent words, free of all legal jargon and racial malice, hit the crowd like a thunderclap. A child's pure-hearted defense was more powerful than any lawyer's argument. Ben felt tears sting his eyes. Lily's unplanned courage was the ultimate defense. She hadn't spoken of law or justice, only of humanity and kindness. Judge Hawthorne looked from the solemn sheriff to the innocent child, then to Sarah, standing tall in her blue dress. He saw not a criminal, but a human being who had been given back her dignity by a man and his daughter. The judge cleared his throat, his expression softening slightly. "This court finds the charges of resisting arrest and grand larceny to be grossly exaggerated and based on questionable testimony. The brutal and inhumane use of chains for this offense is an offense against the territory itself." He banged his gavel. "Case dismissed." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Sarah stood frozen, disbelief warring with overwhelming relief. Ben looked at her, his expression a mixture of profound relief and quiet pride. They had won, not through force, but through a radical insistence on human decency. As Ben led Sarah out of the courthouse and past the stunned, silent crowd, he knew the legal fight was over, but the emotional battle for acceptance in Redemption Creek had just begun. Sarah was now legally free, her second life officially confirmed. But the most important part of her journey, building a new life based on justice, dignity, and true belonging, was only just starting, guided by the quiet strength of the sheriff and the unwavering love of his little girl. The Wild West was a hard place, but sometimes a single act of kindness could change everything. Freedom tasted like the dry Arizona air after a long rain, clean, sharp, and slightly unsettling. Sarah had won her case, her name and dignity restored by the quiet courage of Sheriff Ben Carter and the heartbreaking innocence of Lily. But leaving the courthouse, she knew the legal victory was only the end of one struggle and the beginning of a much harder one. Building a second life in a town that had wanted to see her hang. The whispers in Redemption Creek didn't stop. They simply shifted from accusations of crime to judgments about character. People avoided the sheriff's house, crossing the street rather than walking past. Mrs. Peterson, the store owner, still gave Ben icy stares, and Old Man Hemlock continued his muttering. Sarah understood. Prejudice was a sickness, and freedom didn't instantly cure the people who were infected by it. Ben, though relieved, was realistic. He knew Sarah couldn't stay forever in his house, relying on his protection. She needed work, independence, and a foundation built on her own efforts. The Wild West valued self-reliance above all else. One morning, Ben sat down with Sarah at the kitchen table. "Sarah," he began, "you're free. You have your name and your record is clear. But this town is stubborn. They need to see you stand on your own 2 feet. What can you do? What did you do before?" Sarah thought for a moment, tracing the wood grain of the table with her finger. "I was a cleaner and sometimes I cooked for the ranch hands. But mostly," she said, her eyes lighting up with a spark of pride, "I was good with fabrics. I could mend anything, sew a straight seam, and sometimes even take a tattered old garment and make it look new." Ben smiled. "There's your answer. The whole territory needs a good seamstress. The folks here, they buy one set of clothes and wear them until they fall to pieces. There's an empty little shed by the livery stable. It's a risk, but it could be yours. The next day, Ben helped Sarah clean out the derelict shed. They whitewashed the walls, mended the leaky roof, and Ben secured a loan for a sturdy table, a chair, and a box of thread and needles. Sarah didn't ask for a new sewing machine. She said her hands were enough for now. She put a small, hand-painted sign above the door, Sarah's Stitchery, Mending and Making. The first few days were silent. Not a single customer crossed the threshold. Sarah sat by the window, the sunlight streaming in, mending her own blue calico dress where the seams were fraying. She didn't let the isolation crush her resolution. She worked on, a quiet figure of dignity and persistence. Then, one cold afternoon, Lily came to the shed, dragging her beloved rag doll, whose arm had completely torn off. "Sarah," she said, her lip trembling, "Dolly is hurt. Can you make her strong again?" Sarah took the doll. With careful, patient hands, she not only reattached the arm with tiny, perfect stitches but added a small, embroidered flower to the doll's faded apron. When Lily saw the repaired doll, her face lit up with radiant joy. The little girl ran home and told her story to every child she knew. The next customer wasn't a child, but the saloon keeper, an old, grizzled man named Silas who had openly doubted Sarah. He didn't look at her, only shoving a stack of torn tablecloths across the table. "They need mending," he grunted, refusing to meet her eyes. "By tomorrow." Sarah took the cloth, her expression neutral and professional. She worked all night by the light of a single lamp. The next morning, when Silas returned, the tablecloths were perfectly repaired, the seams strong, the patches invisible. He counted them, grunted again, and silently paid her the asking price. As he turned to leave, he paused. "Good work," he muttered, his voice barely audible. It was the highest praise a man like Silas could offer, and it was the first crack in the town's wall of prejudice. News of Sarah's excellent, honest work spread through the small community like slow smoke. Soon, women brought her skirts to hem and blankets to patch. Men brought her their work trousers and saddlebags. They still didn't speak much, but they saw her. They saw her courage to start over, her pride in her craft, and her resolution to be a contributing member of the community. They were seeing Sarah, the seamstress, not Cargo 74, the fugitive. Ben watched this transformation from afar, a quiet sense of triumph settling over him. He hadn't just saved her from the chains. He had given her the chance to save herself. Sarah was now weaving the threads of her new life, stitch by perfect stitch, proving that the deepest kind of justice is found not in the courts, but in the everyday acts of a life lived with dignity. The shed by the livery stable wasn't just a business. It was a testament to the fact that even in the harsh Wild West, a single act of kindness could blossom into a full, courageous second life. The slow, steady rhythm of Sarah's stitchery began to weave a new pattern into the fabric of Redemption Creek. Her tiny shed, once a symbol of the sheriff's defiance, was now becoming a quiet landmark of resolution and quality work. The town was beginning to respect her pride and skill, even if their prejudice was not entirely gone. But progress always draws out resistance. The deep-seated discrimination of the Wild West didn't vanish just because of a court ruling and some well-mended trousers. The lingering resentment from a few key figures, those who believed their way of life was threatened by the simple concept of justice for all, began to manifest as direct threats. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Arizona sky in fierce, dying reds, Sarah was packing up her tools. The air in the shed was cool, smelling of fresh cotton and lamp oil. A shadow fell across the doorway. It wasn't Silas, the saloon keeper, or any of her new, hesitant customers. It was Bart, a huge, rough-looking ranch hand known for his cruelty and his vocal disapproval of Ben Carter's softness. Bart didn't enter. He stood in the doorway, blocking the light, his presence menacing. "Sheriff's pet," he sneered, his voice a low growl. "You think a blue dress and a few stitches makes you one of us? You're a fugitive, a thief, and you don't belong here." Sarah didn't flinch. Her hands, which had just finished repairing a delicate lace shawl, remained steady on her workbench. She looked up at him, her dark eyes filled not with fear, but with a quiet, fierce courage. "My name is Sarah," she stated, her voice calm and firm. "I am a free woman. I earn my money honestly. If you have mending, leave it on the bench. If you have nothing but insults, then leave my door." Bart laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. He reached out and knocked over her lantern, plunging the shed into near darkness. "I'm telling you to pack up and ride out of this town, Cargo 74. We don't want your kind here. Next time, it won't be just a little push." He kicked a bucket of water, soaking her workspace, then swaggered away, leaving a trail of heavy boot prints in the dust. Shaken, but not broken, Sarah righted the lantern and cleaned the mess. The flood of fear she felt was immediately replaced by a surge of resolution. She had survived chains. She wouldn't be chased out by a bully, but the incident had rattled her. When Ben came by later, he saw the damp floor and the faint scent of fear in the air. Sarah recounted the incident, her voice trembling slightly only when she mentioned his use of Cargo 74. Ben's face tightened with anger, but he kept his voice level. "He won't touch you, Sarah. Not while I wear this star. But the law can't stop whispers and fear." The next day, Ben did something unexpected. He didn't just stand guard. He spoke to the people who had begun to trust Sarah. He spoke to Silas, the saloon keeper. He spoke to the women who admired her needlework. Silas, surprisingly, was the first to act. He had always valued efficiency and good work. He walked over to Sarah's shed, not with mending, but with a new piece of wood. He hammered a loose board back into the shed wall. "This town doesn't need trouble," he grumbled, still avoiding her eyes. "It needs things that last. And your stitches last." It wasn't a declaration of love, but a practical statement of support. Soon after, Mrs. Peterson, the store owner who had been so cold, brought Sarah a small bundle of quality thread, paid for out of her own pocket. "A good tradeswoman needs good supplies," she said curtly. Her prejudice was cracking under the weight of Sarah's unwavering dignity and hard work. The tide was turning. Bart's cruelty, meant to drive Sarah out, had instead done the opposite. It had forced the neutral members of the community to choose a side. They chose the side of the woman who embodied courage and honest labor. A few days later, Ben brought Lily to the shed. Lily handed Sarah a new, slightly lopsided sign she had made with a piece of charred wood and berry juice. It read, "Sarah lives here." Ben looked at the sign, then at Sarah, who was wiping a tear from her eye. "Lily's right," Ben said softly. "You don't just work here, Sarah. You live here. This is your place. You've fought for it with more pride and honor than anyone in this town. And the people who truly matter, they've started to see it." Sarah looked from the simple, loving sign to the sturdy, slightly mended walls of her shop. She was no longer running, no longer hiding. She stood tall in her blue dress, her hands rough from honest work, her spirit unbent. She had arrived in chains, nameless and despised, but she had carved out a life, a name, and a home through sheer resolution. The story of Sarah's second life was now officially written into the history of Redemption Creek, a powerful testament to the fact that justice wasn't just handed out. It was hard-won, stitch by stitch, in the face of fear and prejudice. 7. The threats from Bart and the initial fear had settled, replaced by a deep-seated calm in Sarah. She was now anchored by her work, the respect of a few crucial townspeople, and the quiet, unwavering support of Sheriff Ben Carter and Lily. Her little shed was no longer just a shop. It was a sanctuary, a visible sign of her hard-won dignity. Ben's visits to the shed became a daily ritual. They were never rushed. He'd bring coffee, always too strong, just the way he liked it, and they would talk about everything but the past. They discussed the weather, the price of cotton thread, or Lily's latest adventure. It was in these simple, shared moments that a new kind of connection began to form, one deeper and more profound than the bond of protector and protected. Sarah saw the man behind the star. She saw his exhaustion, the toll the town's prejudice took on him, and the lonely burden of upholding true justice in a land that often preferred vengeance. He never complained, but his quiet sigh as he sank into the worn wooden chair told its own story. Ben, in turn, saw the woman who had blossomed from the scared figure in chains. He saw her courage reflected in the steady movement of her needle, her pride in the perfect seams she created, and the profound depth of her spirit. She possessed a quiet strength that mirrored his own, and a resilience that made his own struggles seem less solitary. One late afternoon, Lily came running into the shed, her face flushed with excitement. "Daddy!" she cried, holding up a mangled stuffed rabbit. The boys were mean. They tore Thumper's ear. She was close to tears, the injustice of the act weighing heavily on her. Ben knelt down immediately, his large hands awkwardly trying to comfort her. "It's all right, sweet pea. We can fix him. Sarah is the best fixer in the whole territory." Sarah took the rabbit. She didn't just mend the tear. She stayed up late, carefully stitching a tiny, beautiful rosette onto the rabbit's ear, turning the spot of damage into a mark of unique beauty. When Ben came to pick up Lily and the rabbit that evening, he stopped at the shed door, the kerosene lamp casting warm light on Sarah's focused face. He didn't speak immediately. He just watched her, her head bent in concentration, her hands working the delicate fabric. He realized then that he wasn't just attracted to her. He admired her, respected her, and deeply cared for the safety and happiness of this woman who had fought so hard for a second life. "That's beautiful, Sarah," he finally said, his voice husky. "You didn't just fix it. You made it better." Sarah looked up, a soft, rare smile touching her lips. "I learned long ago, Sheriff, that sometimes the deepest wounds leave the prettiest scars. They remind you that you survived." Ben stepped into the shed, closing the door softly behind him. He walked up to the workbench, his shadow engulfing hers for a moment. He reached out, not touching her, but gently lifting a large, calloused hand to hover near her cheek. I know this town is still a hard place, and I know I gave you a name and address, but the rest of this life you built on your own, and it's a beautiful thing you've made." He hesitated, the words catching in his throat, a man used to action, not emotion. "Sarah," he said, finally meeting her eyes, "you came here in chains. I want you to know that you are free, and that you are not alone. Not anymore." It wasn't a proposal, not yet. It was a promise. A silent, powerful vow of partnership and enduring support. It was the first, trembling spark of love forged not in passion, but in shared hardship and mutual dignity. Sarah didn't need grand declarations. She saw the truth in the weary lines around his eyes and the genuine warmth in his gaze. She simply reached up and placed her own hand over his, pressing it gently against her cheek. "Thank you, Ben," she whispered, using his first name for the first time. "I haven't just found a second life here. I think I've found a home." The light of the kerosene lamp, flickering softly in the shed, illuminated the quiet moment. In a town built on dust and discrimination, a bond was being formed that was stronger than both, a bond of true human connection, ready to face the world together. The former Cargo 74 and the lonely sheriff had found in each other the strength and resolution to build a future, piece by gentle, courageous piece. The unspoken promise in Sarah's stitchery had cemented the bond between Sarah and Ben. Their relationship was built on mutual respect, shared struggle, and the fierce commitment to justice that defined both their lives. They had found in each other a solace and a strength they hadn't known they needed. However, their closeness did not go unnoticed. Redemption Creek was a town of watchful eyes, and the quiet intimacy between the sheriff and the woman they still privately saw as Cargo 74 fueled the resentment of the community's more hardened, prejudiced members. Bart, the belligerent ranch hand, remained the vocal leader of this hostility, seeing Sarah's success and Ben's support as a direct challenge to his authority and his narrow view of the world. The tension finally snapped one Saturday morning in front of Sarah's shed. Sarah was outside, sweeping the dust from the small porch, her movements graceful and determined. Bart and two of his friends rode up, their horses kicking up dust that deliberately coated Sarah and her storefront. "Still here, ain't ya?" Bart sneered, dismounting slowly, his hand resting conspicuously on the pistol holstered at his hip. Thought a good-for-nothing like you would have ridden out by now. Sheriff Carter won't always be around to hold your hand. Cargo 74. Sarah stopped sweeping. She straightened up, holding the broom like a staff. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but the fear was overshadowed by a fierce, protective pride in the life she had built. She looked Bart directly in the eye. "My name is Sarah," she said, her voice clear and ringing with resolution. "And this is my shop. You are trespassing." Bart let out a harsh laugh and took a menacing step toward her, his friends chuckling behind him. "We'll clear this whole place out for you, Sarah. Get it ready for someone who actually belongs here." He grabbed a sack of her thread and scissors from a nearby bench, intending to throw it. Just as the situation was about to turn violent, a shout cut through the tension. "You put that down, Bart." It was Silas, the grumpy saloon keeper, emerging from his establishment across the street, surprisingly joined by Mrs. Peterson, the stiff-backed store owner. They walked across the street, not rushing, but with a deliberate, unified purpose. Silas, still gruff, stood between Bart and Sarah, facing the bully. "That woman mends my tablecloths better than anyone in the territory," Silas stated, his hands clenched into fists. "And I don't pay good money for someone else to break her things. You want trouble, you start with the paying customers." Mrs. Peterson stepped up beside him, her small frame radiating a surprising courage. "Her work is honest, Bart. You and your bitterness are not. This town needs her. You've been overruled by the community, not just the sheriff." The sight of Silas and Mrs. Peterson, two people who had initially been resistant to Sarah, standing shoulder to shoulder to defend her, was an extraordinary display of community justice. It was the moment Redemption Creek finally chose dignity over discrimination. Bart, confronted not by the law, but by the quiet solidarity of the town's key citizens, hesitated. His friends shifted nervously. He was defeated not by a gunfight, but by the moral weight of the community. He threw the sack back onto the bench. "This ain't over, Carter's pet," he muttered, quickly mounting his horse and riding off with his cronies, leaving the dust and the tension behind. Sarah watched him go, then turned to look at Silas and Mrs. Peterson. She didn't need to speak. The deep gratitude in her eyes said it all. Later that afternoon, Ben came by. He had heard the commotion and the astonishing outcome. He found Sarah sitting inside, working on a patch, looking calmer than he'd ever seen her. "Looks like you had some company," he observed, leaning against the door frame. "And some surprising friends," Sarah replied, holding up the thread. "They didn't just stand up for me, Ben. They stood up for what's right. They stood up for the idea that dignity and hard work are what matter here, not where someone came from or what they look like." Ben walked over, taking her hands in his. "You did that, Sarah. You didn't just ask for a second life. You earned it, piece by piece, until this whole town had to look at you and respect you." He looked at her, his love for her now a solid, undeniable fact. He didn't need to ask her to stay. She was already home. He simply smiled, a rare, genuine grin that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Redemption Creek," he murmured, "finally earned its name today." The battle had been long, but the resolution was absolute. The woman who came in chains had not only found her freedom but had taught a dusty frontier town the true meaning of belonging. The fight with Bart had been the final test, the moment Redemption Creek had to declare its hand. And in choosing Sarah, in defending her dignity and her honest labor, the town had, at last, begun to earn its name. The prejudices didn't vanish overnight, but they receded into the background noise, overshadowed by the quiet fact of Sarah's life. The bond between Sarah and Ben deepened into an acknowledged, profound love. It was a love built not on fiery passion, but on the solid bedrock of mutual respect and shared morality. Ben realized that having Sarah in his life didn't just make him happier. It made him a better sheriff, one whose justice was tempered with an understanding of human fragility and the true cost of discrimination. Their partnership was sealed not with an elaborate engagement, but with a quiet, powerful understanding in the warm, lamp-lit kitchen. One cool autumn evening, Ben found Sarah reading to Lily. Lily was nestled against Sarah's side, completely at ease, her small hand resting trustingly on Sarah's forearm. Sarah looked up, her eyes full of a soft light that had replaced the fear of her past. "She needs you, Sarah," Ben whispered, standing in the doorway. "More than she needs a new dress or a bedtime story. She needs a mother, one with courage and a steady heart." Sarah placed her hand on Lily's head, a gesture of profound acceptance. "And I need her, Ben," she replied. "She was the first person to see me as a person, not a prisoner. She was the one who reminded me what a human heart feels like." In that simple exchange, the family was complete, bound by a love that transcended blood and history. A few months later, Ben did one final, symbolic act to solidify Sarah's second life. He didn't build her a fancy house, he helped her buy her shed. He had the deed drawn up, legally transferring the small plot of land and the tiny building into her name, Sarah Carter. He presented the deed to her on a crisp, clear morning, the document tied with a simple ribbon. Sarah looked at the papers, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of ownership. "It's yours, Sarah," Ben said, his voice full of emotion. "Your land, your shop, your home. You came in chains, but you earned a name, a family, and a place that is truly your own." Sarah walked outside, holding the deed close to her chest. She looked down the dusty street of Redemption Creek. She saw Silas sweeping his stoop, Mrs. Peterson arranging goods in her window, and the children, including Lily, running past, greeting her by name. She had arrived here as Cargo 74, a symbol of the territory's cruelty. She now stood here as Sarah Carter, a testament to the power of human resolution and dignity. She looked up at the sky, her gaze reflecting the vast, unbroken blue of the Wild West. Her past, the chains, the fear. It was all dust now, swept away by the unwavering kindness of a good man and the simple love of a little girl. Her life had come full circle. She hadn't just been saved. She had been redeemed, and in doing so, she had redeemed a piece of the harsh, unforgiving world around her. This was the final, perfect stitch in the making of her beautiful, hard-won second life.